It's a long-established myth that after the death of Prince Albert, Queen Victoria remained in mourning for the next 40 years of her life. This really is just a myth, and it's also a very simplistic approach to how she responded to the death of the husband whom she loved. In order to understand her properly, I think we need to go back to the beginning of her life, and the effect that her childhood had upon her later years. She never knew her father. He died when she was just a few months old, and her mother, a foreigner in a strange country, became totally dependent upon her late husband's adviser, Sir John Conroy. Conroy was an avaricious and ambitious man, and he took complete control of every aspect of little Victoria's life. He tried to keep her from her extended family, and denied her the companionship of children of her own age. Later she would look back on her melancholy childhood, remembering that she had only her dogs and her dolls for company. When she reached her teenage years, Conroy paraded her around the country to introduce her to her future subjects. Dragged from her seclusion, she suddenly had to stand in front of huge crowds of strangers, and even when she was ill, Conroy forced her to continue, as though she were a puppet. Unsurprisingly, Victoria grew to despise Conroy, and as soon as she became queen she dismissed him from her service. Much as she revelled in her new-found freedom, she understood that as a young and inexperienced 18-year-old she needed guidance, and she came to depend completely on her ageing Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne. He was the first man who had ever shown her true respect and kindness, and such was her dependence upon him that when he was voted out of office she refused to accommodate his successor, and Melbourne was returned to power. Her behaviour caused a scandal and a constitutional crisis, and it was fortunate that shortly afterwards she met again and fell in love with her cousin Prince Albert. After a few stormy months at the beginning of their marriage, Victoria soon came to recognise Albert's worth. He became everything to her, all that Melbourne had been and so much more. He was the father of their 9 children. He was her guide in all things political and constitutional. She trusted his judgment in all domestic matters, as well as in the life of the country. He often dictated the letters that she wrote to foreign heads of state, and to her ministers. His death, therefore, when he was only 42 years old, deprived her not only of a husband whom she loved, but also of the prop on whom she had leaned throughout her reign. During his last illness she had refused to believe that he was dying, which made the horror of his death all the more shocking for her. As she wrote later, I stood up, kissing his heavenly forehead, and called out in a bitter, agonizing cry, "Oh, my dear darling," and then dropped on my knees in mute, distracted despair, unable to utter a single word, or shed a tear. In a state of collapse she was led to a sofa where she sat, pleading with her children and members of her household not to desert her, until with the help of her family and attendants she was taken to an adjoining room and provided with an opiate. She was still under the influence of the opiate when she ran along the corridor to the nursery and took her sleeping child, 4-year-old Beatrice, from her cot, wrapped her in Prince Albert's nightshirt and carried her back to her own bed, where she lay in a daze, trying to comprehend the enormity of what had happened. In the days that followed, paralysed by shock and bewilderment, she withdrew from the world, refusing to see anyone but her daughter Alice and the Duchess of Kent's former lady-in-waiting, Lady Augusta Bruce. Numb with grief, she was unable to weep, but then when her tears burst forth, members of the household claimed that they heard her desperate wailing echoing along the corridors of Windsor Castle. It's often been implied that during the early days of her bereavement the Queen was on the verge of insanity, and from a modern viewpoint her excessive grief might suggest that that was indeed the case, but a glance at the evidence shows that this was very far from the truth. In the 19th century death was treated very differently from how it is dealt with today. Black-plumed horses bearing coffins draped in black palls were a common sight, and outlandish statues and headstones cluttered the churchyards. Victorian literature was filled with dramatic death scenes, which the people of the time relished but which now appear overly sentimental. One need only think of the outpouring of grief at the death of little Nell in the serialisation of Dickens' The Old Curiosity Shop, or the death of Beth in Louisa May Alcott's Little Women. In the average middle-class home, gloomy paintings and embroidered inscriptions about the briefness of life hung on the walls, and even the most popular songs of the time wallowed in mawkish morbidity. Father's a drunkard and mother is dead, and the vacant chair, to name but two. Rather than being viewed as macabre, dramatic demonstrations of grief were seen as signs of respect for the departed, and as evidence of the depths of love they had inspired in the bereaved. In all aspects of life, Queen Victoria was a passionate woman, and one, incidentally, who was very fond of popular novels. So it's unsurprising that her reaction to the death of Prince Albert appears melodramatic. There is also the possibility that the witnesses who wrote of her wailing at Windsor were simply following the tradition of writers of the day to demonstrate the extent of her grief. Moreover, she was sufficiently sane to be preparing for the future. Within 10 days of Prince Albert's death, she had written to her uncle Leopold in Belgium, telling him of her plans for the children, and her own decisions regarding how she would manage things as a widow. Within a matter of weeks she had resumed her constitutional duties. Benjamin Disraeli was quick to remind his colleagues that there is not a dispatch received from abroad, or sent from this country abroad, which is not submitted to the Queen, and it may be said that her signature has never been placed to any public document of which she did not know the purpose and of which she did not approve. Cabinet councils are reported by Minister to the Sovereign, and they often call from her critical remarks requiring considerable attention. There is probably no person living who has such complete control over the political condition of England as the Sovereign herself. She took an interest, too, in her children and grandchildren, and it wasn't long before she was holidaying again, and laughing with her companions. What then has led to the idea of this perpetual mourning? It obviously stems from her reluctance to appear in public. But I don't believe that this was simply because she was so grief-stricken that she couldn't go out, but rather a form of agoraphobia, which stemmed from having been paraded around as a child. She had felt Albert's moral support beside her during their marriage, but now she suddenly realised she was alone. It is difficult, her private secretary wrote to the Prime Minister, to estimate the sacrifice that the Queen has made in consenting to open Parliament in person. It was always a ceremony which, even in her happiest days, she dreaded more than anything else, and now it will be a very severe trial to her, and she will probably suffer from it 2 or 3 days before and afterwards. The Queen herself explained her feelings to Lord John Russell, telling him that to be gazed at without delicacy of feeling is a thing she cannot understand, and she never could wish her bitterest foe to be exposed to. So it was fear rather than grief that kept her in seclusion. And it is to her credit that this essentially shy woman gradually overcame those fears and did appear happily in public again. By the time of her jubilees in 1887 and 1897, she was seen smiling and laughing towards the crowds, greeting them warmly and obviously enjoying the spectacle. So it is a myth to claim that she mourned Albert to the end of her life. For although she always loved him, she did laugh again, she did smile again, she took an interest in life again, in her children and grandchildren, and of course in affairs of state. Parts of this video have been taken directly from my books, Alice the Enigma and Queen Victoria and Her Prime Ministers, both of which are available in Kindle and paperback format. Thank you for listening.